when it's underway until it's completed. Is that what you're saying?
I can tell you that as a general matter, when there are ongoing...
You can see all of this anytime at cspan.org. Now, the House is coming in to debate a couple of measures, including one that would make it illegal to lie about being awarded a military medal for financial gain.
In this case, and I think that it reflects...
Clause 2A to Rule 2 of the Rules of the U.S. House of Representatives. The clerk received the following message from the Secretary of the Senate on May 20th, 2013 at 1:42 p.m. that the Senate agreed to Senate Concurrent Resolution 16. Signed sincerely, Karen L. Haas.
Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, the Chair will postpone further proceedings today on the motion to suspend the rules on which a recorded vote or the yeas and nays are ordered, or on which the vote incurs objection under Clause 6 of Rule 20. Any record vote on the postponed question will be taken later. For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 258, the Stolen Valor Act of 2013.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 258, a bill to amend Title 18 United States Code with respect to fraudulent representations about having received military declarations or medals.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins, and the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Scott, each will control 20 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials on H.R. 258 currently under consideration.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume. This nation is blessed with many valiant men and women who have dedicated their lives to military service. My home state of Georgia has no shortage of these heroes, including Technical Sergeant Barry Duffield, who serves as a bomb disposal technician in the Georgia Guard's 116th Air Control Wing. While deployed to Afghanistan, Sergeant Duffield's job was to oversee teams responsible for an incredibly dangerous job, neutralizing improvised explosive devices, or IEDs. Sergeant Duffield and his colleagues successfully completed 52 missions and helped destroy more than 1,200 pounds of enemy explosives. On January 7, 2013, Sergeant Duffield was awarded the Purple Heart for injuries he suffered during an IED detonation while deployed to Afghanistan in 2011. Sergeant Duffield also earned the Bronze Star and the Air Force Combat Action Medal for his valor during the same deployment. The Purple Heart is one of the oldest and most recognized American military medals, dating back to 1782, when George Washington created what was then called the Badge of Military Merit to reward any singular meritorious action by a member of the military. Today, the Purple Heart is awarded to service members like Sergeant Duffield who were killed or wounded by enemy action. For almost 100 years, it has been a federal crime to wear, manufacture, or sell military decorations or medals without proper authorization. In spite of this, many people have fraudulently claimed to be the recipient of military decorations, and this has unfortunately increased in recent years. In just one state, over 600 people claimed on tax forms to be a recipient of the Medal of Honor in 1 year, even though at the time there were only 132 recipients alive nationwide. To address the increase in fraudulent claims, in 2006, Congress enacted the Stolen Valor Act. This important law expands the penalties for falsely representing oneself as a recipient of any medal or honor authorized by Congress for the armed services. In June 2012, the Supreme Court held in a case called U.S. v. Alvarez that the Stolen Valor Act inappropriately criminalized speech protected by the First Amendment. Specifically, the court held that lying, even about having received a military declaration, is by itself protected speech. The court, however, did note in this same case that in periods of war and peace alike, public recognition of valor and noble sacrifice by men and women in uniform reinforces the pride and national resolve that the military relies upon to fulfill its mission. The court also provided that false claims about military decorations demean the high purpose of such awards. This harm alone does not overcome the high level of scrutiny afforded protected speech. However, the court did find that where false claims are made to effect a fraud or secure monies or other valuable considerations, say offers of employment, it was well established that the government may restrict speech without affronting the First Amendment. H.R. 258, the Stolen Valor Act of 2013, narrows the law to make it a crime when people falsely claim to be a recipient of military decorations in order to carry out a fraud. The bill rewrites the statute to prohibit holding oneself out to be a recipient of certain military decorations or medals with the intent to obtain money, property, or other tangible benefits. The penalty is limited to fraudulent claims related only to the Congressional Medal of Honor and those decorations or medals listed in the statute, including the Purple Heart. This legislation enjoys strong bipartisan support, and a similar bill was passed by the House with overwhelming support last Congress. I urge my colleagues to join me in support of H.R. 258, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Scott, is recognized for 20 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of H.R. 258, the Stolen Valor Act of 2013. H.R. 258 is an important bill because it upholds the integrity of military medals as well as corrects a constitutional flaw in a statute intended to protect the integrity of those honors. Without question, all of those who serve our nation deserve to be honored, and those who have gone beyond their peers in serving our nation deserve special recognition. It is especially appropriate that we consider this bill just before Memorial Day, a special day when we remember and honor the sacrifice of those who died serving our country in the military. One way in which our nation recognizes the outstanding bravery and sacrifice of service members is to award these dedicated men and women special medals and decorations. Recipients of these distinctions often have received serious injuries or made supreme sacrifices defending our nation. To ensure that these honors bestowed on these recipients are not diminished, Congress must do all within its power to prevent anyone from falsely claiming that they have received these medals and decorations. While that was the goal of the original Stolen Valor Act enacted in 2006, the Supreme Court in 2012 found that the breadth and scope of that legislation ran afoul of the First Amendment's free speech protections. In that case, Justice Kennedy wrote that while few may find the respondent's statements anything but contemptible, his right to make those statements is protected by the Constitution's guarantee of freedom of speech and expression. But Justice Kennedy, in writing that opinion, also set out certain parameters he suggested that would pass constitutional muster should Congress seek to rewrite the legislation. He advised, where false claims are made to effect a fraud or secure monies or other valuable considerations, say offers of employment, it is well established that the government may restrict speech without affronting the First Amendment. The text of H.R. 258 was crafted to carefully comply with that guidance. As drafted, the bill prohibits individuals from fraudulently representing themselves as recipients of a narrow group of special military honors in order to obtain money, property, or other tangible benefits. H.R. 258 ensures that anyone who falsely represents that they have been awarded these honors in order to benefit in some material way will be subject to criminal sanction. I support the bill because it protects the honor of our military medals and decorations while also respecting the First Amendment. I urge my colleagues to support the bill and reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Georgia.
Mr. Speaker, I'm now pleased to yield to Mr. Heck, the sponsor of this legislation and a tireless advocate for servicemen and women.
For how much time?
As much time as he may consume.
The gentleman from Nevada is recognized.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to urge my colleagues to join with me in restoring the honor and valor of our military heroes by passing H.R. 258, the Stolen Valor Act of 2013. On June 28, 2012, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down the Stolen Valor Act of 2005, concluding that the broad nature of the law infringed upon the guaranteed protection of free speech provided by the First Amendment of our Constitution. The Court determined that the Act sought to control and suppress all false statements on this one subject, without regard as to whether the lie was made for the purposes of material gain. However, in concurring with the decision of the plurality, Justice Breyer stated that, quote, a more finely tailored statute that shows the false statement caused specific harm or was at least material could significantly reduce the threat of First Amendment harm, while permitting the statute to achieve its important protective objective, end quote. Mr. Speaker, that's exactly what my legislation does. The Stolen Valor Act of 2013 resolves these constitutional issues by clearly defining that the objective of the law is to target and punish those who misrepresent their service with the intent of profiting personally or financially. Defining the intent helps ensure that this law will pass constitutional scrutiny while at the same time achieving its primary objective, which is to preserve the honor and integrity of military service and awards. In 2006, every member of both the House and the Senate clearly understood the need to protect the integrity and honor of military service and demonstrated that by unanimously passing the Stolen Valor Act in each chamber. That body understood that the proliferation of false claims occurring in the time cheapened the integrity of the military award system and threatened the trust and honor bestowed upon military service members and veterans by this nation. Mr. Speaker, the need to protect the honor, service, and sacrifice of our veterans and military personnel is just as strong today as it was in 2006. The need is just as strong today as it was last year when this body passed the 2012 Stolen Valor legislation 410-3. The need will be just as strong as long as there are individuals who continue to lie about service in order to gain notoriety, profit personally and professionally, and to receive benefits reserved for those who fought in defense of this nation. This House has the opportunity to once again show our service members and veterans that we value the sanctity of their sacrifice, while at the same time protecting the constitutional rights that they fought so hard to protect. This past Saturday was Armed Forces Day, and a week from today is Memorial Day. Mr. Speaker, what better way to show our support for our brave servicemen and women than by passing this legislation before us today. H.R. 258 enjoys broad bipartisan support with 124 co-sponsors and is supported by numerous veteran service organizations, including the Veterans of Foreign Wars, the Association of the U.S. Navy, the Fleet Reserve Association, the National Association for Uniformed Services, the National Guard Association of the United States, the Association of the United States Army, the Military Officers Association of America, the Military Order of the Purple Heart, and AMVETS. I want to thank Chairman Goodlatte and Ranking Member Conyers for moving this important legislation through the Judiciary Committee. I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 258, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of our time.
Gentleman from Georgia reserves. Gentleman for Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Georgia.
Mr. Speaker, this is an important piece of legislation. I would appreciate gentleman from Nevada bringing this forward and moving it forward as we go ahead, and I would at this point urge all of my colleagues to vote yes, and I will yield back the balance of our time.
Gentleman yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass Bill H.R. 258? Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, two-thirds being in... Gentleman from Georgia.
I request the yeas and nays on this bill.
Yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 1073, the Nuclear Terrorism Convention's Implementation and Safety of Maritime Navigation Act of 2013.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Union Calendar Number 60, H.R. 1073, a bill to amend Title 18 United States Code to provide for protection of maritime navigation and prevention of nuclear terrorism and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins, and the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Scott, each will control 20 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia for 20 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials on H.R. 1073 currently under consideration.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to yield to Mr. Sensenbrenner, the Chairman of the Crime Subcommittee and the bill sponsor, as much time as he may consume.
I thank the gentleman from Georgia for yielding. I sponsored this legislation to improve the ability to protect the United States from terrorist attacks, including attacks using weapons of mass destruction or attacks involving ships and maritime platforms. H.R. 1073 implements obligations of 4 multilateral counterterrorism treaties. Full ratification of the underlying treaties will not be achieved until Congress amends existing criminal provisions of the United States Code. This legislation was prepared in full cooperation with our Democratic colleagues on the committee, following months of work by committee staff in consultation with the Departments of Justice and State. The importance of this bipartisan legislation is evidenced by those who have joined me as original co-sponsors. Gentleman from Virginia, Judiciary Committee Chairman Bob Goodlab, Ranking Member John Conyers, and Crime Subcommittee Ranking Member Bobby Scott. 2 of these treaties concern nuclear and radiological materials, the sabotage of nuclear facilities, and the protection of nuclear facilities and materials used for peaceful purposes. The other 2 treaties relate to the use or targeting of ships or maritime platforms as a part of a terrorist attack, transporting of certain materials by ship for terrorist purposes, and the transport of terrorists by ship, among other things. The International Convention for the Suppression of Acts of Nuclear Terrorism was signed by President Bush on behalf of the United States on September 14, 2005. It requires the U.S. to criminalize certain unlawful acts relating to the possession and use of radioactive material and radiological dispersal devices and damage to nuclear facilities. An amendment to the Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Material, which was adopted at a diplomatic conference on July 25, 2005, requires the U.S. to criminalize nuclear smuggling and sabotage of nuclear facilities. The 2005 Protocol to the 1988 Convention for the Suppression of Unlawful Acts against the Safety of Maritime Navigation requires parties to criminalize the use or targeting of a ship or a fixed maritime platform in an act of terrorism. The protocol forbids certain maritime terrorism acts in the maritime transport of biological, chemical, or nuclear weapons or their components, delivery means, or materials under specified circumstances. It also forbids the maritime transport of terrorist fugitives. The 2005 Protocol to the 1988 Protocol for the Suppression of Unlawful Acts against the Safety of Fixed Platforms located on the continental shelf criminalizes terrorist acts involving a fixed maritime platform. To combat these types of terrorist threats, we effectively need both a comprehensive domestic legal framework and a broad international legal framework to facilitate international cooperation. Existing law may cover certain obligations under these treaties, but in order to fully comply and ultimately ratify the treaties, parties to the agreement are required to criminalize certain conduct and to fulfill extradition requirements and other obligations relating to international cooperation. Parties to the underlying treaties are required to criminalize certain acts committed by persons who possess or use radioactive material or a nuclear device. And parties are obligated to extradite or prosecute alleged offenders. As they relate to maritime terrorism, the underlying treaties treat vessels and fixed maritime platforms as a potential means of conducting terrorism activity and not just as objects of terrorist activity. Both the Bush and Obama administration support ratification of these agreements, which have already received Senate advice and consent. Advancing this legislation strengthens international cooperation and information sharing and will ensure that the United States stays at the forefront of global counterterrorism and counterproliferation efforts. These measures are consistent with our domestic efforts to improve homeland security and to promote better international cooperation. It is my hope that the Senate will act swiftly to pass this legislation so that these important multilateral agreements can fully be ratified. I encourage my colleagues to vote in favor of this legislation, and I yield back to the gentleman from Georgia the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields.
Who reserve the balance?
Reserves. The gentleman from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of H.R. 1073, the Nuclear Terrorism Convention's Implementations and Safety Act. This bipartisan legislation, which was reported favorably by the Judiciary Committee in March, is nearly identical to legislation that the House passed by voice vote in the last Congress. H.R. 1073 amends the Federal Criminal Code to conform our laws to our nation's obligations under 4 international treaties that are part of an important effort to update international law for the post-September 11th era. 2 of the treaties, the International Convention for the Suppression of Acts of Nuclear Terrorism and the Convention for the Physical Protection of Nuclear Material, require party nations to better protect nuclear materials and to punish acts of nuclear terrorism. 2 other treaties, amendments to the Convention for the Suppression of Unlawful Acts Against the Safety of Maritime Navigation and the Protocol for Suppression of Unlawful Acts Against the Safety of Fixed Platforms, address the use of ships and fixed platforms in terrorist attacks, as well as the transport of weapons, weapons delivery systems, and the transport of terrorist fugitives by sea. The United States signed these treaties in 2005, and the Senate passed resolutions of advice and consent on all 4 in 2008. We cannot ratify these agreements, however, until Congress amends the Federal Criminal Code to bring it in line with our new obligations. H.R. 1073 does just that and nothing more. It amends Title 18 of the United States Code to explicitly prohibit acts of terrorism involving radioactive material, provides new security requirements for the use and storage of nuclear materials, and addresses the use of ships and offshore platforms in terrorist attacks. With the cooperation of the Justice Department, this bill does not include previously proposed language that was outside the scope of the underlying treaties. For example, the original version proposed by the administration included an expansion of the scope of conduct subject to the death penalty, new wiretap predicates, and authorization for the President to conduct similar agreements in the future without congressional approval. There was no need to argue about these controversial provisions in order to implement the underlying treaties, and those unrelated initiatives have been removed in this version of the bill. So I'm grateful for the spirit of cooperation with which the bill before us has been drafted. The resulting bipartisan proposal has the full support of the Obama administration, and I'm pleased to join my colleagues, the gentleman from Wisconsin, the chair of the Subcommittee on Crime, Mr. Sensenbrenner, along with Ranking Member Conyers and Chairman Goodlatte. I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 1073, and I have 1 additional speaker, so I'll reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Georgia.
I continue to reserve.
Reserves.
Mr. Speaker, I yield such time as he may consume to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. FATTAH.
Gentleman is recognized.
Let me thank the ranking member, and let me thank the gentleman, Mr. Sensenbrenner, who's brought this bill before us. I rise in support of it, and I wanted to use this occasion to also make some additional comments. We recognize that the proliferation of nuclear weapons are the greatest threat that our country faces, and I took a trip with Chairman Young. We went to visit the International Atomic Energy Association in Austria, in Vienna, looking at the weapons development program in Iran. This is a big issue that the Congress has got to pay a lot of attention to, but I also wanted to take a minute as a member of the Energy Appropriations Committee to talk about the administration's requests on both nonproliferation and modernization. The nonproliferation request is flatline. The weapons modernization, which is important as it relates to our obligations and agreements relative to the START Treaty, is well funded, but we think there's some gaps in terms of the planning, and we need to understand more fully in terms of both the B-61 and the W-76, where we're headed in terms of the long-term package. So this bill is important because it deals with terrorism threats in terms of nuclear weapons. Part of dealing with that is to make sure that we continue the work of Senator Nunn and Lugar and the nonproliferation work. And it's also important for our country to modernize our weapons and to do that with a full understanding that we cannot do that on a year-to-year basis. We have to have a long-term plan and understand the entire package. So I thank the gentleman for yielding me this time, and I yield back the remainder thereof.
Gentleman yields.
Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Georgia.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume. H.R. 1073, the Nuclear Terrorism Convention's Implementation and Safety of Maritime Navigation Act of 2013, is a bipartisan legislation to ratify certain counterterrorism treaty obligations. This legislation was reported by voice vote from the Judiciary Committee last month. Similar legislation was unanimously reported by the committee and passed by the House by voice vote also last Congress. Terrorism and the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction do not recognize international boundaries. These treaties are important tools in the fight against terrorism. Each one builds on an existing treaty to which the United States is a party. The treaties and this legislation complement important U.S. priorities to prevent nuclear terrorism, counterproliferation of weapons of mass destruction, and counterterrorism initiatives. Enacting this legislation will reinforce the United States' leadership role in promoting these and other counterterrorism treaties and will likely prompt other countries to join. In addition to bolstering broad security and proliferation prevention goals, these protocols help to promote implementation of certain sanctions against rogue regimes that are hostile to U.S. interests. I commend Chairman Goodlatte and Ranking Member Conyers, along with the sponsor of H.R. 1073, Crime Subcommittee Chairman Mr. Sensenbrenner, and Ranking Member Scott for their commitment to this important legislation. I urge my colleagues to join me in passing H.R. 1073 today, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Yields. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass Bill H.R. 1073? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative.
Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman is recognized.
On this vote, I request the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed. Pursuant to Clause 12A of Rule 1, the Chair declares the House in recess until approximately 6:30 p.m. today.